I'm joined now by our own Dr. Joe Sirven of the Saturday WJCT program, What's Health Got to Do with It? And he visits us every month for a house call, both to talk about medical news and to take your questions. You can call us at 904-549-2937. You can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. And if you don't want us to use your name on the radio, we're certainly welcome to do that. I want to talk. Alzheimer's is a devastating disease, and there's some really interesting news on that front. But I want to start with a topic that I know is of interest to a lot of parents out there, and that is the early age that girls are reaching puberty. There was just a study about this.
Yeah, that's right, Ann. There was a study just published in the Journal of American Medical Association where they looked at the two factors, 70,000 individuals, so it's a huge study, that were born between 1950 to 2005, and they tracked the age of their first menstrual period, and then also the timing to when that menstrual cycle became regular. What they found is that over the decades, the timing to the first menstrual cycle has come down to roughly 11 years. Now, it's not a huge difference. It's 12.5 or something along those lines was the average age when they tracked it back in 1960. But this is like one of the first few huge studies to show that this has now lowered to age 11. And that's the average. That means that there are ages even below age 11 that you may find that they are seeing the first menstrual cycle and a regular menstrual cycle. And that's an indicator of a whole host of things. In fact, the company editorial pointed out that there's a lot of things that this could show us.
So I think anecdotally, as parents, we hear this from our friends, parents of other kids. It does happen seemingly much, much younger. Parents are very often not prepared for it. This study found kids as young as 9, second graders.
It's amazing. The answer is yes. So when people say like, that can't happen, it very much is. And that's the big question is like, why? The assumption, and that doesn't mean they proved it, their guess is that this is more related to nutrition, weight, being overweight, which then opens up the door to more chronic diseases and things of that sort.
And there's some correlation between body mass and almost like kind of the ability to make children is somehow conditioned or predicated on a certain amount of weight.
Exactly. If you are overweight, sometimes then your body can produce hormones that can begin to almost mimic or trigger sex hormones. And as a result, this is a sign of, again, just an overweight population, too high of a BMI, that's body mass index, which is an indicator of obesity and overweight. And that's one element, and that'll probably account for a big chunk of it. Then the rest of it is the question, is this environment, toxins, we can go from plastics, chemicals, you name it. And are they also kind of creating a little bit of hairy-carry here? But to parents out there, if they are the parents of a little girl or something along those lines, and they find that their menstrual cycle is occurring, that's important to get it checked out earlier than they thought. But know this is not an uncommon finding, and now we're seeing the first verifiable numbers telling us that exactly is what's going on.
And yet early menses has a lot of potential health conditions that go with it. And some of them are not that great, and increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of cancer or early death, and those uneven periods that you said before they become regular, a longer period of that can sometimes be associated with infertility.
Yeah, so this is that's the other fascinating part of this is the fact that this could be a marker of just a population health overall, because exactly what you just said is that the younger the age that someone achieves menstrual cycle, that means that is more correlated to those chronic diseases, the ones that you just mentioned. Curiously, they find that the older you are to reach menstrual cycle, because there are some countries that that have that. That's more representative undernutrition and higher correlation to infectious diseases.
Oh,
And so this opens up this interesting door that should this be one of those report card things that we should be looking at? I mean, it made news because it's the first study of its kind for this large number, but maybe this is something that should be tracked all the time.
another thing that they flagged in this study was just the early sexualization of
Yes.
kids, and that's a problem that comes with an early puberty, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. We talk so much about all the issues that occur in preteens, and now if there's this extra added element of a younger age of menstrual cycle, that does open up that whole doorway of concern, earlier sex education. I mean, these are potential, sadly, in some of these young girls, targets for those that could take advantage of this. And that's something that we kind of have to be mindful about with this.
Sure. Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the latest medical headlines with our in-house doctor, Dr. Joe Sirven, of What's Health Got to Do with It? And he's also taking your calls or your questions. You can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. So I want to move on now. Let's talk about Alzheimer's because there's a couple
Yeah.
of really big headlines on this front. The first is the discovery of an Alzheimer's gene.
Yeah, so this gene has been known for a while. What these folks that in this newest study published in the journal Nature Medicine, they had 500 patients, and they found that people who had inherited 2 copies of a very specific gene called ApoE4 had this they almost all had they all ended up with the disease if you had both copies
Wow.
of this gene. What that means is that for a big chunk of patients, that goes from not just being a risk factor, which is how it's classified now, but that they argue could be a sign of a cause, a genetic cause. That would account for about 15 to 20% roughly of all Alzheimer's patients. So it's not everybody, but it does open up the door if it's a gene, and you know how easy it is to get a genetic test.
Yeah.
Should you and would you?
Well, let me ask. So the people who have both of these genes, you say, compose about 15 to 20% of the overall Alzheimer's population. But people with both genes are pretty much going to get Alzheimer's.
Here was the only problem with the study is that that element varies per your ethnicity and race. We know that in African Americans, both copies of the studies gives you a huge risk, and in this study, they found that all of those patients did, but not in other groups because it varies from ethnicity to ethnicity. It may markedly increase your risk, but it does not necessarily mean that it will occur. But in the study, they found everyone who had both copies did have it.
So is this gene the kind of thing that a 23andMe, home genetic testing type thing can pick up?
I knew you were going to ask that because I know people give that away as a holiday gift, and I'm always stunned by that. But nonetheless, yes, this is the type of thing. ApoE4 is not a difficult gene to detect. The thing is, though, there have been all these great new therapies that are out there for Alzheimer's treatment, but they're not approved for both copies of the gene. They're approved for the disease, but they specifically state for this group of patients, these expensive infusion treatments, that you may not be the right candidates because they're the ones most likely to get the side effects, which are pretty serious from these agents. So this really brings on a lot of nuance as to what to do because we don't have the treatments for this group.
So you could have that knowledge that you are likely to develop Alzheimer's, but not have a ton of options at this point?
That is exactly the case. And that's the conundrum. Should you test for something, you'll have this knowledge with this strong sense that this is going to be your future. But again, what do you do about it? And that's going to, in one level, until we get those treatments, it may not be the right moment because I can imagine just the psychological consequences of that.
Be vast. But that does sort of dovetail with our other medical headline when it comes to Alzheimer's, which is they've found now that evidence of financial problems manifesting themselves years before a diagnosis, people falling behind on their mortgage payments, people being in arrears with their credit cards, that I think they combined Equifax data and health data from Medicaid and found that people who were ultimately diagnosed with Alzheimer's had this period of financial disruption and decline.
I think this is fascinating when you combine medical data with something like Credit Card Bureau. It's a reminder that Alzheimer's is a long condition, decade, more than a decade. And so before you have those early symptoms, you may have these kind of very subtle changes. And I think this is fascinating because it tracks with what I see as a practicing physician, that like in arrears, as you ask questions, when did this first start happening? Well, they started missing bills, or they, a risky investment that you shouldn't go down the road. So what this study showed is that indeed that is something that can occur. And it makes sense because in some direction, it's like, when you're making these investments, you're really kind of working on executive function, initiative and things of that sort. And sometimes you lose that inhibition, that thing that kind of pulls you back to put all the money on something. And it's just a reminder that how long this occurs before you show up to a doctor saying that something's not right.
And so I think in keeping with what you're saying, they also found some evidence that, people with this early indicator might be more subject to fraud or manipulation or exploitation.
And that completely makes sense. And it's another reminder of how we just have to be so vigilant for these unusual social situations that, to be honest with you, I never really thought so much about the finances of the individuals when they came and saw me, other than we worried about the safety. Did they turn off the stove? But the financial piece, that's even bigger in this regard, because that gets to, how people want to control and keep their independence as long as you want.
I guess that early diagnosis, if nothing else, could help you perhaps make some of those decisions.
Exactly.
I want to move on to a topic that I think is really interesting. Scientists believe they have identified a gene that makes animals better fathers and maybe even less promiscuous. What is this about?
Oh my goodness. So let me give the disclaimer of first of all, it is in mice, so we don't know how it applies in people, but it is curious. So they found that the adrenal gland of a very specific type of mouse that is known to be very monogamous and nurturing can they produce a hormone that is not seen in their non-monogamous kin, if you will. And this is called 20-alpha hydroxyprogesterone. And it seems to be, when they inject it into their non-monogamous kin, makes them more nurturing and kind and monogamous as a group. Now, that's a fascinating one because no one knew about this particular area, but it opens up the door. What does that mean in humans when we know that it exists?
I'm very interested to know. I want to just quickly, if we can, get a call from Brad. Brad, just briefly, if you can go ahead.
As you guys were talking before, we have dates for women to get breast exams. We have dates for men to get prostate exams. When should we assess the mental acuity of a loved one so we can better help them, to keep them from those monetary issues that seem to happen every time, and just to give them a better quality of life, understanding what they're going through?
Good question, Brad.
Brad, that is a fantastic question. We don't have a particular date or time because there's so much variability amongst people. So there's no screening, if you will, that to be honest with you, officials or public health people have come out with to say, hey, we should get this checked out. Oftentimes that issue that you're bringing up only comes in the context of someone who's presenting with a new symptom. Like if I have a relative or a friend that they're like, something just doesn't seem right, that's when people get checked out, we still don't have a good screening time for, in essence, a brain health mindset. And that's something that we do have to figure out. Your point is right on target. We don't do that. The only group of people that we do things like that for are pilots because of how important they are to public safety.
Well, Dr. Joe, thank you so much for being here. We love talking all the medical news with you once a month. Thanks for being.
And it's always a pleasure. Can't wait till next month.
Same here.